Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the continuation of my book reading of Stephen King's The Cell, or Cell. Here we go. Clay and Tom moved the two bogus Queen Anne chairs against the door, where their high backs did a pretty good job of filling the shattered frames that once held glass. While Glee was sure that locking the hotel off from the street offered flimsy or outright false security, he thought that blocking the view from the street might be a good idea. And Tom had concurred. Once the chairs were in place, they lowered the sun blind over the lobby's main window that dimmed the room considerably and sent faint prison bars shadows marching across the turkey red rug. With these things seen to, and Alice Maxwell's radically abridged tale told, Clay finally went to the telephone behind the desk. He glanced at his watch. It was 4:22 p.m., a perfectly logical time for it to be, except any ordinary sense of time seemed to have been cancelled. It felt like hours since he'd been hitting the felt like hours since he seen the man biting the dog in the park. It also seemed like no time at all. But there is time, such as humans measured it. Anyway, and in Kent Pond, Sharon would surely be back by now at the house. He still thought us of a home. He needed to talk to her to make sure she was alright and tell her he was too, but those weren't the important things. Making sure Johnny was alright, that was important. But there was something even more important than that. Vital, really. He didn't have a cell phone and neither did Sharon. He was almost positive of that. She might have picked one up since they separated in April, he supposed, but they still lived in the same town. He saw her almost every day, and he thought if she'd picked one up, he would have known. For one thing, she would have given him the number, right? Right. But Johnny had one, little Johnny G, who wasn't so little anymore. 12 wasn't so little, and that was what he wanted for his last birthday, a red-celled cell phone that played the theme music from his favorite TV program when it rang. Of course, he was forbidden to turn it on or even take it out of his backpack when he was in school, but school hours were over now. Also, Clay and Sharon actually encouraged him to take it, partly because of the separation. There might be emergencies or minor inconveniences, such as a missed bus. What Clay had to hang on to was how Sharon had said she'd look into John's room lately and more often than not see the cell lying forgotten on his back or the windowsill beside his bed of the charger and dead as dog shit. Still, the thought of John's red cell phone ticked away in his hand like a bomb. Clay touched the landline phone on the hotel desk, then withdrew his hand. Outside, something else exploded, but this one was distant. It was like hearing an artillery shell explode when you were well behind the lines. Don't make that assumption, he thought. Don't even assume there are lines. He looked across the lobby and saw Tom squatting beside Alice as she sat on the sofa. He was murmuring to her quietly, touching one of her loafers, and looked up into her face. That was good. He was good. Clay was increasingly glad he ran into Tom McCord, or that Tom McCord had run into him. The landlines were probably alright. The question was whether probably was good enough. He had a wife who was still sort of his responsibility, and when it came to his son, there was no sort of it all. Even thinking of Johnny was dangerous. Every time his mind turned to the boy, Clee felt a panic rat inside his mind, ready to burst free of its flimsy cage that held it, and start gnawing anything it could get at with its sharp little teeth. If he could make sure Johnny and Sharon were okay, he could keep the rat in its cage and plan what to do next. But if he did something stupid, he wouldn't be able to help anyone. In fact, he would make things worse for the people here. So he thought about this a little, and then called the desk clerk's name. When there was no answer from the inner office, he called again. When there was still no answer, he said, "I know you hear me, Mr. Riccardi. If you make me come in there and get you, it'll annoy me. I might get annoyed enough to consider putting you out on the street." "You can't do that," Mr. Riccardi said in a tone of surly instruction. "You are a guest of the hotel." Clee thought of repeating what Tom had said to him while they were still outside. Things have changed. Something made him keep silent instead. What Mr. Riccardi said at last, sounding more surely than ever. From overhead came a louder thump, as if someone had dropped a heavy piece of furniture. A bureau, maybe. This time even the girl looked up. Clay thought he heard a muffled shout, or maybe a howl of pain, but if so, there was no follow-up. What was on the second floor? Not a restaurant, he remembered being told by Mr. Riccardi himself when Clay checked in, that the hotel didn't have a restaurant. But the Metropolitan Cafe was right next door. Meeting rooms, he thought. I'm pretty sure it's meeting rooms with Indian names. What? Mr. Riccardi asked again. He sounded grosser than ever. Did you try to call anyone when all this started happening? Well, of course, Mr. Riccardi said. He came to the door between the inner office and the area behind the reception desk, with pigeonholes, security monitors, and its bank of computers. There he looked at Clee. The fire alarms went off. I got them stopped, sorry. Doris said it was a wastebasket fire on the third floor, and I called the fire department to tell them not to bother. The line was busy. Busy, can you imagine? You must have been very upset, Tom said. Mr. Riccardi looked mollified. For the first time, I called the police when things outside started to go downhill. Yes, Clay said. To go downhill was one way of putting it, all right. Did you get an answer? A man told me I have to clear the line, and then hung up on me, Mr. Riccardi said. The indignation was creeping back into his voice. When I called again, this was after the crazy man came out of the elevator and killed Franklin. A woman answered. She said Mr. Riccardi's voice had begun to quiver, and Clay saw the first tears running down the narrow defile that marked the sides of the man's nose. Said, "What?" Tom asked, in that same tone as a mild sympathy. "What did he say, Mr. Riccardi?" He said if Franklin was dead, and the man who killed him had run away, then I didn't have a problem. It was she who advised me to lock myself in. She also told me to call the hotel's elevators to lobby level and shut them off, which I did. Clay and Tom exchanged a look that carried a wordless thought. Good idea. Clay got a sudden, vivid image of bugs trapped between a closed window and a screen, buzzing furiously but unable to get out. This picture had something to do with the thumping they heard coming from above them. He wondered briefly how long before the thumper or thumpers up there would find the stairs. Then she hung up on me. After that, I called my wife in Milton. You got through to her? Clay said, wanting to be clear of this. She was very frightened. She asked me to come home. I told her I had been advised to stay inside with the doors locked. Advised by the police. I told her to do the same thing. Lock up and keep, low profile. She begged me to come home. She said there had been gunshots on the street, an explosion a street over. She said she had seen a naked man running through Benzie's yard. The Benzies lived next door to us. Yes, Tom said mildly, soothingly even. Clee said nothing. He was a bit ashamed of how angry he'd been at Mr. Riccardi, but Tom had been angry too. He said she believed the naked man might, she only said might, have been carrying a body of new child. But possibly it was a doll. She begged me again to leave the hotel and come home. Clee had what he needed. The landlines were safe. Mr. Riccardi was in shock but not crazy. Clee put his hand on the telephone. Mr. Riccardi laid his hand over Clee's before Clee could pick up the receiver. Mr. Riccardi's fingers were long and pale and very cold. Mr. Riccardi wasn't done. Mr. Riccardi was on a roll. She called me a son of a bitch and hung up. I know she was angry at me, and of course I understand why, but the police told me to lock up and stay put. The police told me to keep off the streets. The police, the authorities, Clean nodded. The authorities, sure. Did you come by the tea? Mr. Riccardi asked. I always use the tea. It's just 2 blocks down the street. It's very convenient. Mr. Riccardi. Oh, wait, this line. I wouldn't be convenient this afternoon, Tom said. After what we just saw, you couldn't get me down there on a bet. Mr. Riccardi looked at Clay with mournful eagerness. You see? Clay nodded again. You're better off in here, he said, knowing that he meant to go home and see to his boy, Sharon too, of course, but mostly his boy, knowing he would let nothing stop him unless something absolutely did. It was like a weight in his mind that cast an actual shadow on his vision. Much better off. Then he picked up the phone and punched 9 for an outside line. He wasn't sure he'd get one, but he did. He dialed 1, then 207. The area code for all of Maine, and then 692, which was a prefix for Kent Pond and the surrounding towns. He got 3 of the last 4 numbers, almost to the house he still thought of home, before the distinctive 3-tone interrupt. A recorded female voice followed. We're sorry, all circuits are busy. Please try your call again later. On the heels of this came a dial tone of some automated circuit. Disconnected him from Maine. If that was where the robot voice had been coming from. Clee let the handset drop to the level of his shoulder, as if it was grown very heavy. Then he put it back in the cradle. Tom told him he was crazy to want to leave. For one thing, he pointed out they were relatively safe here in the Atlantic Avenue Inn, especially with the elevators locked down and lobby access from the stairwell blocked off. This they had done by piling boxes and suitcases from the luggage room in front of the door at the end of the short corridor beyond the elevator banks. Even if someone of extraordinary strength were to push against the door from the other side, he only be able to shift the pile against the faction facing wall, creating a gap of maybe 6 inches. Not enough to get through. For another, the tumult in the city beyond their little safe haven actually seemed to be increasing. There was a constant racket of conflicting alarms, shouts and screams, and racing engines, and sometimes the panic tang of smoke, although the day's brisk breeze seemed to be carrying the worst of that away from them. So far, Clay thought, but did not say aloud, at least not yet. He didn't want to frighten the girl any more than she already was. There were explosions that never seemed to come singly, but rather in spasms. One of those was so close that they all ducked. Sure, the front window would blow in. It didn't, but after that they moved to Mr. Ricardo's inner sanctum. The third reason Tom gave for thinking Clay was crazy to even think about leaving the marginal safety of the inn was that it was now 5:15. The day would be ending soon, and the arguing that trying to leave Boston in dark would be madness. "Just take a gander out there," he said, gesturing to Mr. Ricardo's little window, which looked out on Essex Street. Essex was crowded with abandoned cars. There was also at least one body, that one of a young woman in jeans and a red socks sweatshirt. She lay face down on the sidewalk, both arms outstretched as if she had died trying to swim. "Veritag," her sweatshirt proclaimed. "Do you think you're going to drive your car? If you do, you better think again." "He's right," Mr. Ricardo said. He was sitting behind his desk with his arms once more folded across his narrow chest, a study in gloom. "You're in the Tamworth Street parking garage. I doubt if you'd even succeed in securing your keys." Clay had already given his car up as a lost cause, opening his mouth to say he wasn't planning to drive, or at least to start with, when another thump came from overhead. This one heavy, enough to make the ceiling shiver. It was accompanied by the faint but distinctive shiver jingle of breaking glass. Alex Maxwell, who was sitting in a chair across the desk from Mr. Ricardi, looked up nervously, and then seemed to shrink further into herself. "What's up there?" Tom asked. "Oh, it's the Aeroquism room, directly overhead," Mr. Ricardi replied. The larger the larger of our 3 meeting rooms, and where we all keep our supplies. Chairs, tables, audio-visual equipment. He paused, and although we have no restaurant, we arrange for buffets or cocktail parties if clients request such service. That last thump. He didn't finish. As far as Clay was concerned, he didn't need to. That last thump was being a trolley stacked high with glassware being appended on the floor of the Aeroquist room, where numerous other trolleys and tables had already been tipped over by some madman who was rampaging back and forth up there, buzzing around on the second floor like a bug trapped between the window and the screen. Something without the wit to find out. Something that could only run and break. Alice spoke up for the first time in nearly half an hour, and without prompting for the first time since she'd meet her. She said something about someone named Doris. And with this part, I'm going to stop it here, guys, for this reading. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye bye.